Every view is a fixation, or at least any view someone holds is a clue to an underlying fixation. So for instance, a common view that gets formed around non-duality, Buddhism, spirituality, awakening environments is that there is no self. Now, this view, this doctrine of no self, and it can only be a doctrine stated that way, right? There's a corresponding realization, there's a corresponding insight. But when we say no self, we're talking about a view. We're talking about a description, right? That hopefully points to something, but that's going to be dependent upon the given individual's, actual insight. However, it can become a view. It can become a view usually for someone who hasn't actually had the insight, or someone who approaches all of this through academic interest or through logic or through understanding, or trying to want to know all of the details of the spiritual unfolding or Buddhism and whatever. And all of that has its place, of course. Scholarship has its place and so forth. But if you are mistaking the understanding for the insight, then you're really playing with concepts. You're rearranging concepts. And this is really where the understanding of views being fixations is helpful. Because if you have a view of there's a self, and I am a self, and I have a self, and then somehow that gets replaced with some kind of insight or a partial insight, and then a partial understanding of the insight that becomes co-opted by thought or the mind, then you may replace that view with a view that says there is no self. Both of these views are views. Both of these views point to fixation. Even to say there's neither a self nor not a self is a view. So I'm not going to give you a view to replace I'm not going to give you a review. I'm not going to give you a view to replace a fixation. Rather, I might use a paradigm, an attunement, a pointing, a transmission that sounds like a view to counteract the long-standing, deeply rooted, buried in our belief structure view that there is a self, for instance. So when I say talk about no self, I talk about no self as a doctrine, a pointing, and or an insight, especially the insight. It is actually counteracting a view. That's what it's doing. The insight counteracts the view. The view can only really be removed by insight. So if one view replaces another view, the underlying fixation is not changed. It might be weakened, but it's not changed. It's still there. That's why I say a view gives away the presence of a fixation underlying. So again, if a view is replaced by another view, if you replace the view of no self, if you replace the belief of a view that there is a self with the view that says there is no self, then what you've done is you've replaced or changed the label of the underlying fixation. And again, the fixation may have weakened somewhat, but it's still there. So this happens in so many areas. This doesn't just happen, of course, in spirituality. It happens in, a common example is the psychology around growing up with difficult parents or a traumatic environment. And so we tell ourselves, I'm going to so not be like my parents, right? I'm going to be the opposite of my parents. I'm not going to do what they did. And often that works to some degree, and sometimes it works to a large degree. But what's not uncommon is we end up being like our parents in a way that we didn't anticipate and we don't see. But because we're telling ourselves we're not, then there are certain labels, interpretations, and so forth that feel like polar opposites. But the underlying fixation, the underlying pattern of whatever it is, abandonment, can still be there. That's just a common, relatable example for a lot of people. But it's similar with any aspect of identity. In particular, when we're talking about the identity structure itself, same thing can happen. The identifying psychology can co-opt the whole thing and turn a partial insight or an early insight into a doctrine that sounds like a later insight, and it's not. Again, it's another view, and the fixation is still there. So really what this ends up being about is relieving the fixations. People sometimes ask me what my method is or how I work, or actually what they often do is they say, your method, or they go, the way you do things, or they tell me how I do things, sometimes critically, sometimes not critically, but I'll hear that from people. And it always sounds a little funny because I don't have a method. Even though you might think I do, I don't. The transmission, the words, the speaking comes from no view. But if I were to define a view, if I were to define a method in any way, it would be that I sense obstruction or fixation and address it. That's probably the closest thing to what actually happens here. So it's not that I'm replacing something or adding something or giving you something new or revealing realization to you or anything like that. It's just like, I feel some fixation, I think, and let's just see what's there, or our attention just goes there. And what happens is the fixation gets released, and it can be released sometimes by an antidote, like, again, an opposing view in the form of a certain type of inquiry or investigation, like no self, like non-dual, not two, not self, like non-separation, like no center, right? These aren't just doctrines. There's ways of pointing, there's ways of inquiring, there's ways of looking into your experience and investigating what's actually happening that will relieve the view and relieve the underlying fixation. It will relieve the underlying fixation first and foremost. That's why the transmission's not at the level of concept. Might seem like it is, but it's not. And then as a result, the view will collapse. And then you'll see, once you see through the self view clearly and fully, it doesn't get replaced by something. It's not like you walk around feeling like a no self, telling people there's no self and there's no one and there's no me and there's no one to practice. That's not a full release of self. That's it's an adoption. It's a restructuring of the belief around self, with maybe some release and some loss of fixation, but there's still some fixation there. Yeah. So, this is also, I love the Heart Sutra. There's a line in there: freed from delusive hindrance, rid of the fear bred by it. And that means psychological fear. And that's exactly what it is. What is liberation? What is enlightenment? Is to be free from delusive hindrance, from fixation, not to have correct views, right? Correct view is only an antidote. It's a thorn to get out a thorn sort of thing. The stick you stir the fire with, it gets burned up in the fire. Hopefully that's not too cloudy.